Otherwise, we'll get started. My name is David Phillips, and I direct the program on peacebuilding and human rights at Columbia University. And we're very pleased to co-sponsor the panel discussion today on the future of North and East Syria with the Syrian Democratic Council. There are a few housekeeping items that I wanted to mention before we get started. Our discussion will be on the record. It's being recorded on the Zoom cloud, and it'll be broadcast live on Twitter at SDC Press. As far as the procedures for asking questions, you can raise your hand using the Zoom function, or just type your question into the chat. So we have an all-star panel to discuss the recent developments in North and East Syria. I visited Kamishlo a little more than a year ago, and I was just struck by the common purpose that was shared by the SDC and civil society that I met there. Everyone was pulling together to try to make the most of their opportunity for peace and prosperity. We know rather tragically that progress in Rojava was undermined by Turkey's aggression, first in Afrin and then east of the Euphrates. And now North and East Syria finds itself in an especially difficult position for a combination of reasons. The COVID pandemic is hitting the region very hard. It lacks the medical infrastructure for testing and for treatment. North and East Syria, the administration still suffers from a large population of displaced persons, including many tens of thousands at Al-Hol camp. The delivery of aid has been restricted by the closing of the border by Turkey, by restrictions that Russia has imposed. Any aid that is conveyed via Damascus tends to be stolen by regime loyalists. To its credit, the KRG provided Kurdistan Regional Government provided some testing labs, but that's a drop in the bucket when you look at the enormous need that's required. And these problems of health and humanitarian nature are compounded by Turkey's recent actions to shut off water supplies. It controls a water station that provides water to 500,000 people, including the residents of Al-Hol camp. Also, conditions on the border are worsening. Turkey used aid provided by the international community to build a double blast wall on either side of the railway line. Okay. The Fishkabur crossing has been closed due to COVID, and the southern border with Syrian controlled territories is open but limited also by COVID and sanctions imposed through the Caesar Act by the United States. Turkey's building a road that will split Rojava in two, enabling it to bypass Iraqi Kurdistan in travel and trade with Iraq itself. So despite the progress and hard work in Syria, it's struggling. Rojava is struggling from Turkey's aggression and a combination of factors that now includes an embargo and continuing difficulties with the Damascus regime. So to explain and describe these challenges more fully, we have a great panel this morning. Pleased to welcome all of our panelists. Especially pleased that our first speaker, Sinam Mohamad, has taken the initiative to organize this panel. Sinam is the U.S. representative of the Syrian Democratic Council. Other panelists include Peter Galbraith, who's the former ambassador to Croatia, a former assistant Secretary General for the UN in Afghanistan. More than 30 years ago, I walked into Peter's office at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he briefed me on Kurdish issues. And I've been grateful ever since, Peter, that you rose my awareness and have kept me motivated. So we all owe you a great debt of gratitude for your work over these decades. Following Peter, we're going to hear from Dana Stroul, who came from the Pentagon, spent 5 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as professional staff. She's presently a fellow at the Washington Institute. And beginning in 2019, she co-chaired the Syrian Study Group, which published at the end of that calendar year an important report on conditions in Syria. David Pollock is also a fellow at the Washington Institute. He's the director of Project FICRA. He serves as an advisor for Near East policy in the Bureau of North, in the NEA Bureau, focusing on democracy and reform, and with a special interest in women's issues. So our panel includes experts with many, many years of experience who are fully engaged in current developments and who will share with us an assessment of current conditions and also a discussion on the way forward to stabilize the situation in North and East Syria and to return it to a position of peace and potential prosperity. So thank you all participants for joining. Thank you panelists for being a part of the discussion. I'm going to give the floor to Sinam Mohamad, who will provide introductory remarks. Sinam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you really for co-hosting also this panel. I would like to thank all our significant panelists here today, Mr. Peter, Mr. David, and Ms. Dana, and everyone who is now participating. I'm seeing also Anne, Mrs. Anne, Ms. Anne Specker, and many other people who are there, or you are welcome today. Thank you so much. If you want to talk about the North and the East Syria, we have to look at the whole picture of Syria, because we are not, separated from what's going on in all over Syria, as well as in the region also, in the whole region. So when we talk about that, let us see how we started in the Northeast Syria to administrate, to organize the people there, to work together. As you know, all over Syria, it is a mosaic with different ethnicity and religions also. So with all these diversities, how could you bring all these diversities together to have a vision for the future of Syria? And it is not an easy task, actually. It's a very difficult, a task. In the beginning, we start to do that. So now, we are now done. We have many people together, working together, like Syriac, Arabs, Kurds, different religions, all in the region now working. And so the model which is in the Northeast Syria now, it is a model which gives the same picture of the whole Syria, the same diversities, the same religions, diversity in the region. So if we want to talk about Northeast Syria, let us have, what we have now in Syria. We have three, regions. The region which is under the Syrian government control, the Assad regime. This is the region, how it's going on there. Everybody knows what happened in 2011 when the people asked for the freedom and dignity. And what is the result now? We have now half of a population being refugees and displaced in other cities of Syria. We have many of the Syrian cities being destroyed. And we have now a very weak economy also in Syria. And this is because of the mentality of the regime, the Syrian government, that insisting to control again the whole Syria as it was in before 2011, as if nothing has happened. Not many people have been killed in this period from 2011 till now. So this is the mentality of the regime, which, which is now controlling this region. And they always think that if they are, if they have the military victory, that they will have the political victory, and which is not true actually. Let us go to other region, which is the region of the Idlib, for instance, Afrin, Tal Abyad, Jarablus, Azaz, and Sherkany, all this region, which is under the control of the opposition. And this opposition, which has many different fragile groups, military groups, who have actually the ideology of Islam there, the most radical. Let me say, and I'm not talking all of them, but most of them, they are like that. For instance, Idlib, we have Tahrir Shah, Sultan Murad, and Jaysh al-Ummah, and whatever. All the Islamic names actually they have. I'm not against the Islam. Understand me wrong, but this ideology of the radical Islam, it doesn't serve, or it doesn't reflect the Syrian reality of all the Syrian people. And it is not the future of Syria which the Syrian people demand. So this model, which is now in Idlib, in Afrin, let us see in Afrin what everybody knows. It's very obvious. Raping the woman, killing the people there, kidnapping, taking ransom. These groups, military groups in this region, they always have the fighting each other, and the victims always the civilian in this region. So there is no stability, no safety, and even the women, they don't have any role there. They suffocated the women voice there in this region. So is this region will be the model for the future of Syria? And this is what we have to ask about. So such model, we did not as a Syrian people come and apprise for having such a model. It is not the model which we wanted for the future of Syria. And let us go to the other model, which is now the other, region in the northeast of Syria, which is controlled by the SDF forces, and even which we have the government or the administration, which governs this region with having the diversity, the religious diversities, ethnic diversities, and the Arabs, you can see the Arabs, the Kurds, the Assyrians, the Armenians, all they are working together in order to make this administration more and more successful. And even here you can see the role of the women, which has played a very significant role in this administration, in all aspects of life, in the social society, in diplomat, in politics, even in protection, in the military. So you can see the women how could, not only Kurdish women, I'm talking about the Arabs also who are now joining the Kurdish women there. So they are always all together wanted to have this region safe and stabilized. So this is what we can see in this region, this model, the model of, I'm not going to brighten the picture in this region. Everybody will look and say, oh, it's an ideal model. No, it is not like that, because it is a new model. All the people, they are trying to do their best in order to have a very successful model there. But still, we have many challenges. We have the challenges of the regional challenges as well as the inside challenges. So we have the threat of Turkey. It is not stopping from 2011-12 till now. It doesn't stop at all. Till now, we have always threatening. In 2019, they control Tal Abyad and Ras al-Ain, Sherkany. So all this, Turkey is still continuing the threat, even to get the other region on the border as to create a safe zone, which I don't think it is a safe zone. It will not be safe. It will be an occupied zone, actually. Because what happened in Ras al-Ain in Sherkany in 2019 when they make a safe zone there, what happened there? Now we have the result. 300,000 be displaced. The other people, they come to the region which is not from this, city or the region. So demography changing is going on, just same as it has happened in Afrin before. So is this model, will be the model of future of Syria, in what's happening in Ras Al-Ain and Sherkany and all this? They destroyed the environment, they destroyed the holy shrines, they destroyed the society actually there. So nobody can say I'm Kurds, so they will be killed. I am Yazidi, they will be kidnapped and killed. So, and you know, all of Syria, we have even the Christians in Afrin, they were afraid, so they left Afrin because they will be killed. So this is the model. And as comparing to the model in the east, northeast of Syria, we can see the differences, you know. As I say, it is not an ideal. We need to improve it. We need the support for this model in order to survive and to be inspiring the other region in Syria. So what we have in the beginning, we have the very clear political vision for the future of Syria. Decentralized Syria, democratic Syria, democracy in Syria, as well as the secular, you know. And you know, all these things, maybe now, most of the Syrian people, they agree to, you know. So what we ask now, all the Syrian democratic groups of Syria, the democratic people of Syria who are in the other parts of Syria, let them come together, let us sit at the table so that we can have discussion together. And we will discuss what is the future of Syria look like, you know. I don't think anyone wants to have Syria as a model of the radical Muslim, as in the, in the other places in the, like Afghanistan and whatever, in Pakistan, all these things. I mean, in the during the that time when the Al-Qaeda was there. So nobody wants that, you know. Even the Muslim people, they will not agree to this model, because most of the people, they are moderate Muslim. They are not so radical Muslims, you know. But these groups who is affiliated with Turkey, actually Turkey played a very negative role in this, in Syria. And so who is the victim now? The Syrian people, they were the victim for this agenda of Turkey. I think this is very important that Syrians must know that. Now we are playing a very great role in defeating ISIS, in protecting the region, not only our region, whole Syria, even from the ISIS and all these terrorist groups. And even the United States, they say that this is the forces only that we can rely on to defeat ISIS and to defeat the terrorists. So now, if we talk about such models now, 3 models in Syria. So which one we need to be the future of Syria? I'm not saying that the model in the east of Syria, maybe we can discuss together. This is very important, to how to make it maybe better. So the vision must be decentralized Syria. Otherwise, I mean, I hope here that the United States, the global coalitions countries, all, they support such model and improve it, empower such model. If you empower the model in the north of Syria, northeast of Syria, in this way you can weaken the central government, Syrian government in Damascus, just in this way. Believe me, when they see such a model became the model inspiring all the Syrian people in the other region, like for Durzis and for the Alawite in the coast, everyone, they would like that. So this one will weaken the government in Damascus, and in such way, as long as you empower this model, the central government will be weak. And this is the way. I mean, the United States, they implement the Caesar Act in order to ask the regime of Syria to come to the table and have a pressure on, you know. But who is suffering now? All the Syrian people suffer. Even in our region, we suffer. Mr. David, you mentioned that. So we suffer from that. But in our region, still we would like to overcome such economic crisis there as we have many measurements in the region. I mean, we increase the salary of the people. We have the, improved the lives of the people there. I mean, we try to do something in the region in order to overcome this economic crisis, but still there is difficulties because of the Syrian pound has been dropped down, everybody knows that. And all this, the influences the administration in the north of Syria, northeast of Syria. So this is the model. I think we can have such model in all over Syria, and in such way, decentralization is the solution for all the Syrian people. Otherwise, actually, I'm just telling, otherwise, if it is failed and Turkey will achieve its goal for this region, we will be at the gate of the sectarian war in Syria. This is very obvious. So we have to stop it. We have to start finding the solution for the Syrian issue, to have all the Syrians sit at the table, at Geneva table, as the SDC administration must have their role at the Geneva table, as well as in the Constitution Committee, which will be, I think, have a meeting in August. So we are not there. How can you write the Constitution of Syria and 5 million people represented if they are not at the table? Thank you so much. I can stop here and maybe I can answer the question if there's any question. Thank you so much.
The model that exists in the administration of North and East Syria. It's a model based on grassroots democracy, founded on the principles of decentralization and secularism, on environmental sustainability. And you talked about the important role of diversity and of women in leadership. Not only is this model inspirational for Syria, it's inspirational to other countries in the region. And we hope to see the experiment in Rojava expanded nationwide and regionally. Peter Galbraith, the floor is now yours.
David, thank you.
Peter, you have to unmute yourself.
Try again.
Okay, there you go.
All right. David, I want to just express my appreciation for the role you played in these series of webinars, and also the long association that you've had with the Kurdish cause going back at least to 1990 or 91. I wanted to also, Sinam has made really an excellent presentation of the aspirations of many Syrians, a description of what's gone on in Northeast Syria and the ideas. Since I'm speaking to you from Vermont, I would be remiss not to talk about the Vermont connection, because in 1980, a fellow who had gotten his PhD from Columbia named Murray Bookchin in philosophy noticed that Vermont and Burlington, Vermont had elected a socialist as its mayor by 10 votes. And so he moved to Vermont to join the experiment being carried out by Mayor Bernie Sanders. And he developed a philosophy that you have just described, David, of strict gender equality, of representation by many communities, and of radical environmentalism. And in the 2000s, Abdullah Öcalan, having a lot of time for reading on his island in the Sea of Marmara, picked up the works of Murray Bookchin, which had been translated into Turkish. And this, I think, has provided a great deal of the philosophical basis of what has actually been achieved on the ground. And there's a whole cohort of people here in Vermont who are very enthusiastic about Northeast Syria. And if I can speak politically, of course, that wing of the Democratic Party is in general in favor of disengagement but not from Northeast Syria. So there is a constituency there. I wanted to discuss a bit, however, we've had an excellent account of what's been achieved. And indeed, Sinam, I have many impressions of my various trips to Northeast Syria, including being at one point, I think it was 2016, on the front lines with a group of young women who had just taken a police station from ISIS. And that they were disciplined, they were very sober in their approach, very professional. And they were really indistinguishable from the male fighters. And that's something that is really very unusual in that part of the world. But there are many aspects of the gender equality. I would have to say that perhaps some work has to be done on the environmental issues if you travel around, but perhaps that will come. I wanted to look to the future, since that's the subject of this panel, and to analyze it in a strategic way. Obviously, the great threat that to Northeast Syria comes from Turkey. And it's worth observing just how the situation has changed. A year ago, the war in Syria was largely over. The fighting wasn't over, but the war had been decided. In an area that was west and south of the Euphrates, the Syrian government had prevailed, all except for essentially for the area around Idlib. Turkey had a small presence there and north of Aleppo. And east of the Euphrates was, and of course the Syrian government was brought to this position by its two main allies, Iran and Russia. And to the east of the Euphrates, the Syrian Democratic Forces, supported by the United States and by some of the European allies, controlled about a third of Syria. And you could, and neither of these forces were at conflict with each other. And so you could imagine that there would be some kind of dialogue or negotiation. Now, it wasn't a happy solution for those who would have wanted to have a different story for Syria, but the war was essentially over. Then in October, Trump made the decision to give Erdogan a green light to launch the attacks that he did. As a result of that, the SDF had no choice but to accept a Russian brokered initiative to bring the Syrian government back, at least to some degree, in that area, an agreement for a much larger Syrian government role. So a certain irony for an administration that had made and complained about Iran's benign activities as a major reason to, for example, in the joint JCPOA with Iran, it played a huge role in facilitating Iran's ally in Northeast Syria. But the situation now, in fact, is that the threat from Turkey remains. And although Syrian forces have come back and there's also a Russian presence, they're really a very minimal help. And they are not going to be able to deter Turkey should it take further action. Therefore, it comes to, and perhaps in a time of disappearing American leadership in the world, nonetheless, Northeast Syria is one place where the United States' role is absolutely key. But unfortunately, it depends on a very unpredictable president. I think it's quite clear, looking at the polls, that Mr. Trump will not be the president on the 20th of January, 2021. This election is entirely an election between Trump, and the American people, by an overwhelming margin, one that can't be overturned by the Electoral College or the Supreme Court, have made up their minds about Trump, and they do not want him. But that said, I think it's unlikely Trump will do anything radical between now and November 3rd, Election Day. But the great danger, because he would face a lot of criticism, including from Republicans, the great danger is what happens in the 79 days between November 4th and January 20th, because at that point, there'll be no constraints on him. There may be some deterrent in terms of Turkey because Erdogan will know that the next president is Joe Biden. Of all the candidates in the Democratic Party, this is the one who knows this area the best, who's known the Kurds for 30 years since they came to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1988, and then again in the 1990 and thereafter. He was personally engaged both as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and then as a vice president. And Tony Blinken, his principal foreign policy advisor, has said that in fact he would keep US troops. So that may be some deterrent, Erdogan knowing that Biden is going to come in to action. But there is a danger that Trump will, an unhinged Trump will simply give a green light to Turkey to do what it wants, and that Erdogan will conclude that this is the window of opportunity. It's very tough to figure out what kind of strategy Northeast Syria might pursue. But it has a few cards that can help. First, it's very helpful that it has made a deal with the, it's patched its relations up with the Kurdistan regional government, and that it has finally, 6 years after the Doha agreement, made an arrangement with the ENKS. Now, whether that is implemented is always a question, but that's a help. It probably isn't sufficient to deter Turkey at this stage. It might have been a different coalition back 6 years ago, but perhaps not at this point. So I think there are a few other things that are worth considering. One is to talk about gender, because there is a community in the United States and Europe that is deeply admiring of what Northeast Syria has accomplished in terms of gender equality. In fact, one of the people who's been in touch with me about this is Gloria Steinem, who is the, maybe the grand dame of the equal rights for women movement in this country. So that is something, and it's something worth also for Europeans. The second thing is to keep people aware that ISIS is not gone, and of the critical role of Northeast Syria in terms of being the bulwark against ISIS and the opportunity that ISIS would have if Northeast Syria collapsed. One of the ways to do that is to be focusing on the situation of the detainees, because every time there are people who come out, particularly children, and I'm thinking it would be a good idea to get the children out, that highlights the issue and of the critical role. And finally, it's worth reminding the Trump administration, particularly the vice president, of the significant community of Christians that exist in Northeast Syria. In fact, Mike Pence, in October, when he went to Ankara and had his meeting with Erdogan and announced a ceasefire, which was really a capitulation to all of Erdogan's claims, he agreed in effect to the ethnic cleansing of the population between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. What he didn't know is that these were Christian areas. And so he who styles himself as the defender of Christians, was in effect an agent of ethnic cleansing of the Christians. And so that raising that issue goes to a constituency. But all of these are steps that can be taken. I would also say to Sinam, who's an excellent ambassador from Northeast Syria, that particularly as you focus on the period from November 4th to January 20th, at that point, all the Republicans will have abandoned Donald Trump. And so it's important to be in touch with as many of them in Congress for what it's worth. But in the end, it's going to be a very difficult period, and there isn't much that can be done about an unhinged president who is going to pull everything, who may pull everything down on his way out. The final bit of advice I would give is to say, whatever you do, don't, between now and then, rely on the United States. You'll recall that in October, James Jeffrey persuaded you to abandon your defenses. And I saw this, the trenches being filled in on the grounds that this would appease Turkey. But Jeffrey didn't speak for Trump, didn't represent the administration. I think there's some splendid people there. Ambassador Roebuck is one. But their word, they're sincere, but they don't speak for the US. So in this period, it's important not to give up something that would be to your advantage, because you simply can't rely on the US for this period of time.
The US disengagement. I'd just like to add that in a deeply divided Washington, after the conversation between Erdogan and Trump on October 6th, there was a unified voice of outrage, including many evangelicals. What happened to the Syrian Democratic Forces and America's betrayal is an outrage that we all share. They went to war with ISIS at our behest. 11,000 SDF members died, 23,000 were seriously injured. And then as soon as we were on the verge of destroying the caliphate, we threw them under the bus. So that's an outrage that across the aisle, people in Washington and around the country share. And this question of Christians being attacked is an item that we'd like to highlight further. And we're planning to do a series of Zoom calls about that. I see that Basham Ishak from the Syria Council is with us, and Basham, we'll be talking to you. Peter, did you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to observe that you're exactly right. There was all that outrage. The trouble is, it didn't actually make a difference. And that is really the dilemma, because unlike any American administration we've seen, it simply isn't responsive to the normal behavior of the US government. And that's why this period coming up is going to be so dangerous.
Thanks for pointing that out. We're going to turn now to Dana Stroul. Dana, the floor is yours. Let's try to be efficient in our remarks because we're running a little short on time.
Thanks so much. And thank you to the SDC for inviting me to be part of. Sorry. I am going to cut down my remarks to leave some time for Q&A, but where I want to start is with the Syria Study Group of 2019, and just a few remarks about that group. What is noteworthy about the group, because some of Peter's remarks ended on where the partisanship and bipartisanship is in Washington, D.C., the Syria Study Group was so interesting because Congress legislated it, mandated that 12 appointees, six democratically appointed and 6 appointed by Republican members of Congress, come together and produce a consensus report. So a bipartisan report making policy recommendations for the United States in Syria. And this is interesting because this is members of Congress coming together saying, Syria and what happens to the future of Syria is important enough to the United States for us to fund this group to spend a year working and debating these issues, traveling in the region, talking, and for all of the other high priority foreign policy issues. The only other 2 that have come out of Congress recently, in addition to Syria, is one on what a good national defense strategy should be, and a second one on the future of Afghanistan. So Syria is up there for how members of Congress view US priorities, US leadership, and investment in what happens. The report, first of all, attempted to create a baseline of core findings, and I just want to review just the top line of some of those findings. 12 members of the group together said, Assad has not won this war, even though militarily, backed by Russia and Iran, his regime has succeeded in retaking territory except North and Eastern Syria and Idlib province. It went through all the ways in which Assad has not regained control, has not been able to provide services, reconstruction, etc. in regime-controlled areas. And it said that the main reason that the war is not over despite the regime's territorial gains is because the root causes of conflict have not been addressed. And namely, that is Bashar al-Assad and his regime's behavior itself, And Sinam talked about this as some of the original origins of the conflict to begin with. The report discussed that although ISIS no longer holds territory, it is still resurgent, capable of reconstituting, capable of launching attacks, and that not resolving the huge population, not only of detainees, but the families, the children and women associated with ISIS detainees, and leaving it for the SDF to handle without outside support and without a medium-term solution sets a horrible precedent and creates the foundation again for ISIS's resurgence. The report talked about a political process being completely solved. So Sinam again talked about what the future political vision of Syria could be, which is decentralization. To get to any agreement on decentralization and how that works in practice, there needs to be political agreement. The entire international community has continued to look to Process 2254, the political vision laid out by the UN Security Council, as the roadmap to get to a political consensus. Again, there's been no progress there. The report talked about Russia being incapable or unwilling of compelling the regime to take actions that could sustainably end the conflict, that despite repeated Israeli military strikes inside Syria to push back on Iran, Iran was undeterred from entrenching itself and was bolstering its military activities with social, cultural, and religious and economic activities inside Syria for long-term influence. And the report warned of the very destabilizing nature of a potential Turkish military incursion and the distraction it would cause, both from stabilizing areas where ISIS had already been defeated and distracting from the goal of defeating ISIS. It lauded the SDF for the incredible work on the ground in defeating ISIS, but noted that the challenge at the time, so this is last September, was to transition from those combat fighting operations to stabilization activities. And the reality is today that despite the tremendous US military support, the United States has never matched that military support with diplomatic or development activities and reinforcement that would be needed to support the autonomous government in Northeast Syria from doing that transition and providing and delivering on that political vision for the populations there. And finally, the report warned about the humanitarian crisis and the failure to address the refugees all throughout the region, as well as the displaced people inside Syria. Everything I just described remains today, except after our report came out, 2 weeks later was the fateful Trump-Erdogan phone call, the green lighting of Turkish military operations, the Pence visit to Ankara, the temporary Trump administration sanctioning of key Turkish leaders and key ministries in order to attempt to halt that progress or the Turkish military actions. I also want to talk about what the report recommended for US policy. It said two things. It described US policy broadly as diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, economic coercion through sanctions to deprive it of resources, and denial of reconstruction aid absent key regime behavior change. It also said that what the United States was doing by partnering with the SDF in Northeast Syria is critical and the main source of leverage for US contributions toward a political process. And it talked about the energy, oil and gas, and also the agriculture. So the economic powerhouse of Syria is in Northeast Syria, and therefore the United States could assist the autonomous authority in leveraging those resources, which the regime ultimately needs for a stable Syria, toward a political process in which there's some political gains for the autonomous authority in Northeast Syria. So this is the key aspect where today the United States has still not articulated a vision for Northeast Syria. And since this webinar is about, excuse me, the future of Northeast Syria, I just want to conclude by making a few observations here. Because the United States, as the main partner for the Kurds in Northeast Syria, will not be specific about what its objectives are, either politically or militarily, other than defeating ISIS for Northeast Syria, this region remains in limbo. Not only that, but the United States has undermined itself because of the mixed messages and constantly changing messages from the White House. Not only that, But there's now less troops and less territory throughout Northeast Syria with an even more limited military objective. And meanwhile, Syria's economic collapse affects what happens in Northeast Syria. COVID-19 throughout all of Syria obviously affects what can happen in Northeast Syria. The collapse of Syria's currency affects what happens in Northeast Syria. And now Caesar sanctions coming online will deter whatever economic development might have transpired in Northeast Syria going forward. Now, many people have focused on Caesar Syria sanctions as a key for US policy. And I just want to caution that in my view, Caesar sanctions themselves do not add new authority that the United States did not already have from previous regimes of sanctions that it could have used to both target Assad and regime cronies, as well as Russia, Iran, and businessmen who might consider doing business with the regime or inside Syria. The question is how this administration or a future Biden administration chooses to use the signaling of Caesar, which is that Congress acting together on a bipartisan basis decided to pass a 5-year sanctions package that says US sanctions relief will only come after key regime behavior changes. This bill, Caesar, does not call for Assad to exit power, but it essentially calls for such serious changes in the behavior of his regime, it's difficult to see how Assad could remain in power in Damascus without, and still get sanctions relief without certain kinds of fundamental behavior changes like accountability for all of the war crimes that have happened under his regime over the course of the last 10 years of conflict. I'll leave it there. Again, I agree with Peter that members of the Biden campaign have signaled no openness to changing political isolation, providing sanctions relief, or providing reconstruction aid anywhere in Syria without behavior change by the Assad regime. What's different, however, I think potentially under a Biden administration is that stabilization aid, so those activities, turning the lights back on, clearing rubble, landmine clearing, providing some basic support so that services can restart in Northeast Syria. That is a huge package of aid that is different from humanitarian aid, which was cut off at the beginning of the Trump administration. I think that a Biden administration would have interest in exploring whether or not stabilization aid could reinforce the very important military work that's already taking place between the US military and the SDF. I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Can't hear
David,
you.
you need to unmute yourself.
I unmuted myself. Is it my turn? Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go right to David.
All right. Thank you, Bassem. Yeah. So I'm going to be extremely brief because I do want to encourage some discussion. And I thought I would start out simply by saying I completely agree with the previous speaker's assessment that the model of the administration, the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria, is a better one than that of the Assad regime or of Turkey and Syria or of the jihadi, what's left of the Syrian opposition. No question about that. However, as a matter of real world political prospects and options, I don't think that, honestly, I have to be very frank about this, my analytical assessment is that just because that model is better doesn't mean it's going to continue to have support, and especially in view of the importance of Turkey to the United States and to Europe and to the region as a whole, as other players perceive it. So I want to focus my remarks on Turkey and on the US government's assessment of Turkish policy going forward, and where I agree and where I differ with that assessment, and what I think that means for the people of Northeast Syria. I would say that my own view is that Turkey is a malign actor in Syria. I think that has been the case for many years, since the beginning of ISIS and continuing right up until today. But that doesn't really matter because Turkey is a very important ally of the United States and a very important country for, as I just said, for European countries, major European countries, and for other important players in the region, whether it's Russia or Iran or Israel or anybody else. And nobody is going to sacrifice their interest in good relations with Turkey, even if it's under Erdogan, and even if they are engaged in ethnic cleansing and massive human rights violations and occupation, forcible occupation of additional territory across the border in Syria. Nobody is going to simply throw Turkey under the bus the way we almost threw the Syrian Kurds and the SDF under the bus. So we just have to accept that as a bitter pill to swallow, but that is the reality as I see it. So now let's ask what can be done about it? Well, what does the US government, how does the US government see this? I would say that the US government, based on private conversations with the most senior US policymakers, not including, as several people have already pointed out, the most senior of all, President Trump, who could change this on a dime, but everybody else in senior roles on these issues. I think that the US government sees that it is still possible to deter Turkey from further military adventures in much of northeastern Syria, and to maintain an American, very small but important American military presence there, and to maintain our relationship with the SDF and with the people of northeastern Syria, and especially with our Kurdish partners there, General Mazloum and the PYD and others, and the SDC, and so on. The US government believes that Turkey is content with a limited military presence in northern Syria, and that the US continued presence there is actually, as the Turks see it, in Turkey's own interest as a kind of buffer against direct military clashes with what is still a very potent militia, the SDF, and the possibility that in extremis, the SDF might turn to an alliance with Russia and with the Assad regime in order to counter further Turkish military advances or other dangerous and troubling policies toward the Kurds and the other people in that region. So that's the US government assessment, and to a great extent, I am inclined to actually agree with it, although I think we are in danger of seeing some additional Turkish military advances in some of the border areas, but probably not into the major, mostly Kurdish populated cities of northeastern Syria, and probably not further south. And so that's number one. Number two, at the same time, I do not share the US government's assessment that Turkey is likely to have a fundamental change of heart on Kurdish issues, whether in Syria or anyplace else inside Turkey, or even in relations with the KRG in a positive direction in the foreseeable future. And I mean for years, not just months. And why do I say that? Okay, number one, I think that there is an argument that Erdogan, and this is a very important historical, but I think it's only historical. There is an argument that Erdogan once engaged in a peace process with the PKK inside Turkey, once had regular consultations at senior levels with the PYD, and once cooperated, at least tactically, with the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, the PYD, on border security and other issues. But that was then, and this is now. And I don't see any sign that Erdogan's change of heart in 2015 in a very negative direction on all of that is going to change. Then there are some in the US government and elsewhere who believe that maybe Erdogan will be replaced someday by some other figure inside the AK party or from some of his potential split off parties in Turkey, and that other people will have a very different view about all these policies. I see no sign whatsoever that any of that is likely to happen. And then there is a view that in the long term, the Turkish population itself is turning against Erdogan and his hardline policies toward the Kurds, and someday will vote him out of power, that the younger generation in Turkey has a different view of all of this. Number one, in the long term, as John Maynard Keynes famously said, we are all dead. So if we're talking about something that might happen 15 or 20 years from now, I don't see really the point of waiting for that to happen. Number two, I unfortunately don't see any sign that the younger generation in Turkey, even the more secular, more liberal cohort there, much as they may dislike Erdogan, I don't see any sign that they're more favorably inclined toward the Kurds. And I say that with great sadness and regret, because I think there was a moment 5 or 6 or 7 years ago when that could have changed, but I think that moment has passed.
David, I'm going to have to ask you to conclude your remarks.
Yeah, so to make a long story short, as I was just about to say, I'm afraid that we are unlikely to see Turkish policy change for the better, not only toward the Kurds in Syria, but I see signs that of a harder Turkish government policy even toward the KRG in Iraq. And much exactly as the KRG patches up its relations with the Syrian Kurds, Turkey will try to find ways to prevent that or to circumvent that and to pursue a very hardline Kurdish policy, both at home and abroad. So what to do about all this? Very briefly, I would say that the one element that has not been mentioned, I think, by the other speakers, that is an important part of American decision-making on these issues is the US military. And the US military has a great store of affection and respect for the Syrian Kurds, for our partners in the fight against ISIS, and both, as well as for the Iraqi Kurds, of course. And so I believe that it might be maybe the single most important thing not to give up on American support, as I heard one of the panelists seem to imply, but rather to double down on the relationship between the PYD, the YPG, the Syrian Kurds writ large, and their local allies in Northeast Syria, and the KRG, and the US military, very specifically. And to look to build and strengthen that relationship so that in the uncertain months and years ahead, there will be an important counterweight to the continuing, whether we like it or not, great weight that Turkey carries in American councils of state. Thank you.
So I would just respond that we agree with you that Turkey is a malign actor. I personally don't agree that it doesn't matter. Its crimes against humanity, against Kurds in Syria, its recent incursion into Iraqi Kurdistan, its role in Libya, its nefarious activities in the Eastern Mediterranean, very serious questions about Turkey's intentions and its reliability as an ally. And I hope that we consider that fully as we develop new policies towards Turkey after January 20th. So we're at the conclusion time of our panel, but we do have a series of questions which I'd just like to raise. Peter, many of these questions are directed towards you. So I'll give you the last word. One question has to do with what kind of new policy towards Turkey we can expect from a Biden administration, and will there be a new special envoy appointed for Turkish-US relations and Kurdish issues. The other question has to do with the attacks against Christians and Syriacs, most recently this morning, and what's the appropriate response. So let's extend our panel by a few moments. Peter, why don't you address those questions, and then we can ask the other panelists if they want to make a concluding statement.
Thank you, David, and thanks to the panelists. I don't know what a Biden administration will do or what personnel it will appoint. So I'm not going to go there. I can comment on the statements that have been made about support, keeping troops in Northeast Syria. But I think the larger question of Turkey is this. Whether Turkey's an ally or not, the debate between the two Davids on this panel, in some sense doesn't matter, because the problem is, even if you think that Turkey is not a reliable ally, and certainly I don't think that, it's what happens if you actually break the relationship with Turkey, and how would Turkey then behave? How would an unhinged Erdogan behave? And so that really is the dilemma, even if you conclude that Turkey does not share the democratic values of that are at the heart of the modern NATO alliance. The other point I'd make is about the Russians and the Syrian government. For sure, that is the making a deal is the option for Northeast Syria, for the SDF. The problem is that neither of them are very reliable allies. I mean, the problem that Northeast Syria has indeed is that it doesn't have any reliable allies. The Syrian government did not send sufficient forces in response to a request for Afrin or to the area in Northeast Syria to deter Turkish troops. The Russians didn't. And the US, I certainly would say that in fact, I would agree with David Pollock that the Kurds need to maintain the relationship with the US, particularly with the military. It's just, it needs to know that it can't rely on the United States, that it's unpredictable and untrustworthy at this time. And so when there's a quid pro quo that's disadvantageous, such as the one that Jeffrey negotiated, which involved the dismantling of Kurdish defenses, and everybody needs to know that the population is literally right on the border. The wall is visible in Amude, in Qamishli, and other places. So when they dismantled the defenses, in exchange for a promise that Jeffrey was not able to deliver because he didn't actually speak for Donald Trump. And finally, on the issue of the attack against Christians and Syriacs, it's such a tragedy, and indeed this whole war Sinam reminds us that it's not just about Northeast Syria; it's about Syria itself. She calls it a mosaic. It's what made Syria such a wonderful place, but the war has really done a lot to destroy the diversity of Syria, and it is both the Assad regime and the opposition. I mean, it's worth remembering that in 2011, some of the slogans were by the opposition, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. As a result, many of them stayed with the regime along with secular Sunnis because the alternative appeared to them to be more risky. But inevitably, this has been destructive to the minorities, particularly the minorities of the Christians and Syriacs. And I guess one final point is just as it's hard to chart a future relying on the US, The Geneva process, the constitutional process, Sinam is exactly right that, of course, the Kurds, the Northeast Syria is not there, but those processes are not going to go anyplace. So one is excluded from a process that's really a fig leaf. And the reason they're not there, of course, is because of Turkey, and that's why it's not meaningful. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Peter. So let's go to closing statements. Let's try to keep it to a minute or less. Dana, you first, then David, and then Sinam, you get the last word.
I would just make a broad comment about a potential Biden administration and the future of Syria, but building off of Peter's comments on Turkey, in general, the United States has imperfect partners with which it works. Turkey's within the NATO alliance, but across the Middle East, all of the governments with which the United States has traditionally and historically partnered have huge problems, whether it's commission of atrocities, horrible problems in the conduct of military operations and civilian casualties, whether it's policies domestically that have led to sectarian or ethnic cleansing or religious cleansing, atrocious human rights abuses, many of which across the region have been exacerbated in the current context of COVID-19. So a Biden administration, I think, will be confronted across the board with very vocal voices calling for the rupturing or recalibration of many of these relationships because of the problematic actions of the leaders at the helm, like Erdogan and Ankara. And a Biden administration simply cannot accomplish its objectives for stability, security, ending conflicts without any partners, even problematic partners. So I would just throw that out. And then on the doubling down of the US military relationship with the SDF, I absolutely think that's important. And in fact, there's a bipartisan consensus in Congress that thinks that is important as well, which is why the funding and the authorities for continuing the US military presence is always there. But it is surprising to me that we constantly focus on the military to military relationship and don't talk about the diplomacy or the development that is required. There is no military solution for stability in Northeast Syria, and there is no military solution to get to a political roadmap, and there's no military solution to sustainably defeating ISIS. So until the United States and its partners are ready to have an honest conversation about the conditions that would be required to eliminate the ISIS threat or provide stability in Syria that eliminates the underlying causes of conflict, we'll be having the same conversations over and over.
David, to you.
Thanks. I want to just be clear about what I said. When I said it doesn't matter, I don't mean morally. I don't mean in terms of our political positions. I just mean that analytically, I don't think that there is anyone in the region or outside the region who is simply going to cut off relations with Turkey. Even if Turkey continues its malign activities in Syria and many other places in the region and beyond. So, and it's not about NATO. I want to make that point. Turkey is a member of NATO. Yeah, I guess that's important. We can argue about whether it shares NATO's values or not. I would agree that it doesn't anymore, but that's not why Turkey is important, not because of its NATO membership. It's important because it's a major military, economic, diplomatic, geographic, and demographic power in the Middle East. That's why it's important, especially for purposes of this discussion. So even if Turkey were somehow kicked out of NATO, which there is no prospect in the real world, I think would ever happen, Turkey would still be there and we would still have to deal with it. And we would still have to balance our relations with the Kurds and the Turks and all the others. I'm just trying to be brutally realistic, I guess, about all this. And personally, I absolutely support the autonomous administration in northeastern Syria and the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and for that matter, the HDP inside Turkey, and the Kurds in Iran, and so on. But I don't think that we should, much as we can't count on the United States in any absolute way, I think we certainly cannot count on anyone standing up to Turkey in an absolute way about any of these issues. It's just not in the cards, in my view.
Sinam? Sinam, you have to unmute.
So I would like to say here, if we want to have, I mean, the future of Syria, I'm not only telling about the future of our Northeast Syria, all of Syria. If we would like to have the bright future, we have to come together with all the democratic forces and democratic parties in Syria, come together to decide the future of Syria together. This is very important. As Turkey, yes, I agree with everyone. Turkey it is a very significant country, powerful, whatever it is. We know that. And it is on our, border, neighboring, more than 900 kilometers on our border. So we are not, from the beginning we said, and many times even our officials, representative, who is representing the SDC or the administration, even the political parties, all they say, we are not against Turkey. We want to build a good relation with our neighborings, either Turkey or whoever, Iraq, whatever is it. We would like to have, we know that we can't survive alone, we can't survive alone. How can we survive? We have more than 900 kilometers on our border, north border. So we have to build good relation with all the neighboring countries, but still, what kind of neighbors we have now? This is the problem. If my neighbor is considering me as an enemy and attacking and killing my people, how can I say, we are neighbors together, we have to. So this is the role, I think, of the United States and even the EU, how to build these relations together with our neighboring, like, Turkey, which is the main one now. How can we build this relation? How can we establish a good relation in Turkey, which Turkey now, inside Turkey, they have a lot of problem actually, inside toward the Kurdish people there. So democracy in Turkey, it is now not anymore, existed. And everybody knows that. By arresting the party of the HDP, parliaments, the members, by arresting the member of the journalists who are Turkish, people. So whoever raised their voice against the Turkish government, they will be arrested, and it is very important. So I think to have the good relation with Turkey, this is the mission of the United States and the other countries, EU, how to build this relation together, depending on respecting the other neighboring, respecting our principles and our people there. We also can respect, and we are very happy. And even that time we say, when we have the administration, we never even shell one bullet toward the Turkish border, and everybody knows that. So I would like to say that our forces, SDF, they are not the one who is, attacking Turkey. Turkey is attacking us. The SDF, they protected the whole diversities there. They protect the churches. They protect the Yazidi shrines as well as the mosque. And this is a very great symbol that you are protecting all the religions, diversities there, as well as the ethnic diversity. So this is what we hope that we can do it together, and with the help of the United States, with the help of the global coalition, the EU countries. This is very important. Turkey is not accepting us alone to have the deal with it. So this is very important to have such creating the stability in the whole region. It needs to have a good relation with each other on the border. Thank you so much.
So the Kurds can be a force for democratization in each country where they reside. Thanks to the panel for talking about the Rojava model, sharing some details, also addressing some of the very serious challenges that exist. We've learned a lot from the panelists. We're grateful to the participants for joining the call, and we look forward to continuing this conversation as we move forward after November and thinking about America's role in Syria and the Middle East. So many thanks to the SDC, the panel, and the participants. We're now formally adjourned.
Thank you for everyone. Thank you so much.
Yes, hello, Tom?
Thank you.
Okay, just adjourning a Zoom